Hello, and welcome to the Final Ghost podcast, where we watch horror films, but we also read horror books. This is Anna, co-founder of the Final Ghost Collective and your podcast host. If you're new to the show, or you've somehow found it through book talk or book Twitter, this podcast takes a horror trope and explores it in depth through discussions with special guests. We've done witches, vampires, female monsters, and are currently wrapping up our teen horror season. So if this is your first time listening, you should know I'm also a massive book nerd. And on occasion on this podcast, we do what I've called the Bloody Book Club. We're interviewing some of the women who are writing horror right now. It's a sporadic series, very much based around availability and a genuine love of horror fiction. I've interviewed authors Emily M. Danforth and Katrina Ward, and this time around, I'm so pleased to have spoken to Chelsea G. Summers, the author of the cannibal novel of the summer, A Certain Hunger. I knew I had to read this book the moment I saw a New York Times piece called "Why Can't Women Be Serial Killers Too?" A Certain Hunger, which has just been released in the UK by Favor this very month, follows a very smart, very accomplished food critic who is as voracious about food as she is about men. That is, having sex with them and also on occasion killing and eating them. Dorothy Daniels is an anti-heroine and murderess for the ages. As a woman psychopath, the white tiger of human psychological deviance, she says, "I am a wonder, and I relish your awe." It is a demonically funny book, told from the point of view of this female psychopath who has never been shy about indulging her exquisite tastes. To quote Lady Gaga, "I don't believe in the glorification of murder. I do believe in the empowerment of women." I know listeners of The Final Ghost will enjoy this one as much as I did, so I can't recommend it highly enough. And with all that said, please enjoy my conversation with author Chelsea G. Summers. Chelsea, thank you so much for giving up a little bit of your time to talk to me. I've been a big fan of your book and scoured quite a few bookshops trying to find it here in the UK before I finally relented and ordered it online.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
We're going to talk mostly about your novel, A Certain Hunger. But before we get into the book itself, I wanted to ask you a little bit about yourself and your own relationship to horror, either in book form or in film form.
Yeah, so I don't actually watch a lot of horror, primarily because I have never enjoyed stories that are animated by the bodies of dead women. So I do love Jennifer's Body, which is not. I love Raw, which is, not so much. I love vampire stuff in general, just because it's, sexy and sleek and melancholic. Most of the horror books I've read were based in my scholarly stuff, which was 18th century. So, like Matthew Lewis's The Monk is huge in my mind, and I've written on it a couple of times. I wrote on Bram Stoker's Dracula a couple of times. I wrote on Carmilla. But then, because I grew up in the 70s and 80s, I also read my way through the earlier Stephen King oeuvre and have that basis as well. But I'm not a huge horror person. I like aspects of it. Mm-hmm. I like the body issue. I like the fact that it deals with grief, which at least in American culture is, specifically white American culture, is something that we're very, very bad at. I do watch a lot of horror TV, not so much movies.
Mm-hmm. Intriguing. So can you talk a little bit about then why you decided to actually write a horror novel?
I didn't.
Oh.
Yeah, I had no idea that I wrote a horror novel
Hmm.
until it got embraced by horror readers. And then I was like, oh, okay, that makes a lot of sense. In my mind, as I was writing A Certain Hunger, I saw it as a satire. I saw it as a novelistic memoir. I saw it as kind of an anti true crime book. Um, I saw it as a story of friendship, but I never understood it as a horror book. And now that, people have pointed out the fact that it is horror, I'm like, oh yeah, no, I get that. I never really thought of American Psycho as horror.
Hmm.
And I now can understand why it would be considered horror because there's blood and guts and, you know, and murderiness and all of that. But when I think of horror, I think of, vampires. I think of The Shining. I think of zombies. I think of, people following you and trying to kill you in the dark, which of course my protagonist does, but I guess I just completely blanked out. And I'm not alone in this. My agent didn't
Hmm.
see it as horror. My first editor at Audible didn't understand it as horror, and my editor at Unnamed didn't get it as horror. And I might add, Faber, who is publishing it in the UK,
Hmm.
my editor there was like, really? It's horror? I'm like, yeah, it's horror. Apparently, what it is feminist body horror. I had no idea.
I mean, is that a label that you have embraced since people,
Yeah, yeah.
audiences and readers
I
have
mean,
labeled it a feminist body horror?
yeah, absolutely. I mean, like, the author is dead as far as I'm concerned. I'm DED, you killed me, it's cool. Like, I truly, I knew that I was writing something that was not easily categorizable. The Having people put it within the category of feminist body horror, and there's a lot that like I just recently finished Rachel Yoder's Night Bitch,
Yes.
which is feminist body horror, and I freaking love that book with an extra flamey white hot burning
I've
passion.
got it on my
um,
nightstand right now.
it's so bloody good. I can't even wrap my head around it. I can't even be mad at how good it is. Um, and as similarly, like I love Angela Carter,
Hmm.
and The Bloody Chamber was a huge, and also Nights at the Circus, which is not horror, was a huge inspiration for me in writing my book. Carmen Maria Machado's Her Body and Other Parties. I deeply, profoundly, achingly love. So now that it's kind of my book has been embraced by feminist body horror people, or that's the tag that is frequently attached to it on Goodreads, I'm totally cool with it because I can see it. It was never ever in my mind as I was writing it.
So can you elaborate a little bit of what was on your mind when you started writing it? Kind of if you weren't deliberately or knowingly kind of going in the horror direction. You've mentioned, writing it as a novelistic memoir or as an anti-true crime book or as a satire. Kind
Hmm.
of what how did it feel like when you were in the
Well,
writing process?
yeah, so I really wrote it because I was motivated by spite. I had recently been dumped by a really beautiful and very stupid Italian man. And I had been living in Italy, and I took the summer back in New York, and then I was like, all right, I'm going back to Italy on my own terms. And I found myself in this 17th century villa. I was supposed to be there with a friend. She had fallen in love with this winemaker up in Piemonte. I was in Montalcino in Tuscany, and I'm alone in this villa that's at the end of a dirt road. The only thing that keeps me warm in the middle of fall into winter is this tiny wood stove that's like literally the size of a personal pan pizza. So I was incredibly angry and sad, and I was like in my mid 40s, and I really wanted to express the rage that I felt about being dumped, not just this time, but repeatedly throughout the course of my life. And and I'd had this image of, my ex-boyfriend being impaled on rebar, and I that was the very first scene I wrote. And then I ended up writing the rest of the book. And really, what motivated me was wanting to see a book with a narrator who inhabited the emotional world that I was in, which was an aging woman who felt frustrated in her career, who felt, like my voice was not being heard, who felt like bereft about the state of my love life, and who felt, more than a little bit murderous. Yeah. So yeah, writing it, like I really went in, once I nailed the voice, I
Mm-hmm.
just, like I wrote a few chapters, then it sat for a really long time. Then I edited my friend Molly Crabapple's memoir in 2014. Uh, at the end of April, I decided, okay, I will give myself 6 months to finish my novel. That's what I'm going to do for the next 6 months.
Mm-hmm.
That's my goal. And so I did. And then it was a really long, rocky road to getting it published.
And I'm definitely going to ask about that, but I wanted to talk about the voice and
Mhm.
Dorothy specifically. Kind of how did she come into focus for you? Because she does have, from the very first opening paragraph and until the very end, such a specific, deliberate, decisive voice, and one that it's, I mean, I find spite a great motivator for a lot of things, but I would definitely did not read her as angry at all while I was reading the novel.
Mhm.
I found her kind of quite not aspirational, of course, but kind of extremely confident and appealing, so appealing because of that confidence and that kind of snobbery that she has throughout her voice. I found it fascinating,
Yeah.
and I wanted to keep reading her because even though I know that she would have murdered me, or at least very much judged my life choices, I still wanted to hear more from her. So it's such a specific tone of voice. Can you talk a little bit about how you found her?
Yeah. Yeah. So, like, from the very beginning, I saw the book as kind of a love child between Eat, Pray, Love and American Psycho. Um, that, uh, I didn't make it all the way through Eat, Pray, Love. I made it through Eat and Pray. And then once she got to Love, I was like, all right, I'm tapping out. I read American Psycho this summer before I started writing my book. Of course, I read it, when it came out, but I reread it the summer before, and then I was like, all right, I'm good. I don't need to look at it again. So I kind of let those two works simmer
Hmm.
together, and I read a bunch of food writing, and specifically Gail Green's memoir. Uh, I read like the first three chapters, and I latched onto that chatty, revealing, kind of loquacious voice. And once I had that, I was like, all right, and I'm good. I'm done. And it was really the voice that kind of kept me going. It was a very cathartic experience writing the book. I got to exercise a lot of demons. I got to give in to a lot of the murderous rage that I had. I basically got to live my life, my inner psychopathic life, without any consequences, but eventually getting paid for it. So that's cool.
And can we talk a little bit about the choice of making her a serial killer? And
Hmm.
and why do you think the figure of the serial killer, which is such a potent and recurring figure, both in kind of the more documentary true crime
Hmm.
genre, but also in fiction, both TV and film and books, why is it so appealing to us, do you think, kind of, and why make Dorothy a serial killer?
Well, it would have been a short story if she just killed one guy, but it wouldn't even been a novella, really.
Fair.
Uh, so, you know, I had been, like many people in the mid 2010s. Like I was consuming a lot of true crime. My favorite thing was Snapped, which I don't know if you have it in the UK. So it's on Oxygen, or it was on Oxygen, which is television for women. Like that is their tagline. And Snapped is it's a true crime story about women who kill, or
Mm-hmm.
women who get charged with killing. Maybe they're not guilty. Um, and at the same time, like I was watching Hannibal, which, Brian Fuller, like bow down, kiss the hem
Absolutely.
of his garments. Like it's just so great. Um, but I felt really cranky, and I always have from the very first time I read the Thomas Harris books, which again were when they came out. Um, that Hannibal was always so good at everything,
Mm-hmm.
and of course, if it's Mads Mikkelsen who can actually cook and actually dance and actually speak multiple languages and whips out a bottle of vodka in the middle of an interview, like he's just so
Mm-hmm.
perfect. And I wanted to write a character who wasn't perfect, who did make mistakes, who did kind of run counter to our expectations of the serial killer. And one of those big expectations, and something I take on very much, headlong in the book, is that it's going to be a man. um, and our I as a feminist, I have an issue with the Victorian concept of the fairer sex. I have an issue with the ways that women are perceived to be somehow at once less trustworthy and more ethical, or more moral, or less violent, or something. And I think that there is a lot of room for exploration of what those expectations and views say about our values and our gendered values in the culture. So, a great deal of the reason why I wrote A Certain Hunger was to unpack some of those ideas and thoughts in my own head, and then, hopefully in other people's as well.
I mean, that gives me I'm just aggressively nodding here because I've just written an entire book about about those very ideas.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm curious, kind of, why do you think seeing or reading female serial killers, female murderers, in fiction is still so rare and still seemingly so shocking? I was reading a few of the reviews of A Certain Hunger, um, about kind of how shocked people were to read about a woman graphically and very unapologetically kill and delight in killing men or killing in general. Why do you think it's still so
Well, it's
people are taken
it's the
aback?
promise, it's the promising young woman thing. It's the threat of upending not merely individual men's lives, but the social order. Where then the social order is that women don't do these things. And if they do, they feel really bad about it. Um, and I think that history shows that women do these things, and they don't necessarily feel bad about it. And I don't think that, murder or murderous impulses or murderous rage, even if it's not acted upon, is a gendered construct. Um, it's not a gendered emotion, and it shouldn't be. And I feel that one of the wonderful things about bloody fiction, whether that's crime fiction or horror fiction or something that defies genre in any kind of neat way, is that it allows you, regardless of where you are on the gender spectrum, gender ball, um, to experience what are otherwise discomforting and uncomfortable emotions. Um, and the interest in specifically true crime by specifically women is a very interesting and complex thing. And I suspect, although I haven't done much work in it, the interest that women have and the response that women have to horror is also a really complicated and interesting thing, because the idea has always been, all right, men like horror because men can identify with the hunting, preying, and masculine energy of the killer, and women don't like it. But women do like it, and women do
Mm-hmm.
make it, and women do spend money on it, and women think about it, and women consume it. And, especially if you're looking at books, we frickin' buy the most of it. Um, and I think it's because, just, like, I'm not identifying with the women who are killed and sliced open. I am identifying with, if not the final girl, then
Mm-hmm.
I am identifying with the rage that goes into, or whatever the murderous impulse is, that goes into, that into the serial killer. I can identify with a serial killer much more easily than I can identify with a victim, because I am not a victim.
Mm-hmm. And do you think there is picking up on that note, do you think there's still a certain
Sorry, I didn't mean to get all polemical.
No, I actually I completely wholeheartedly agree with you. I mean, that's the whole basis of this entire podcast, this collective, this project, was because it was always looked upon until quite recently, when there's been a mushrooming of
Mm-hmm.
initiatives, festivals, blogs, zines, podcasts, what have you, made essentially around centering women's reactions to horror fiction in all of its myriad different forms. And I've always just, perhaps this is too simplistic, but I've always just said that horror was invented by a teenage girl, which it was, by Mary Shelley. So we can go back,
Yeah.
way back to
Right.
that. And the fact that there's still people that are trying to discredit her as the author of Frankenstein, does not surprise me, unfortunately, but still is baffling. But I think it's kind of inherently political, because we continue having to prove the fact that we can identify, and we can feel seen, and can just enjoy horror fiction or horror narratives without having to pass judgment on them or on the people making them, or necessarily
Yeah.
identify with, as you mentioned at the very start of our chat, kind of with the dead bodies of women, who are usually kind of the inciting incidents of a lot of these stories, for better or worse.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering, kind of, do you think there is a particularly female angle that you wanted to take? And I know we've kind of talked a little bit about feminist body horror, as your book has been tagged retroactively. Do you think there's kind of a distinctive female element that you wanted to bring to it, precisely because the writing is so explicit about bodies, about the killing, about the consumption of them, and about the sex as well?
Yeah. Well, honestly, it was about menopause.
Fair.
Like, I'm if I have to look over my shoulder
Mm-hmm.
now and see what the book is about, it's about menopause. Um, and it's about moving from a time of visible fecundity
Mm-hmm.
to a time of cloistered withering. And I think, like, it's not mine alone, but, my anger at not at being postmenopausal. I'm delighted to be postmenopausal. Like, woohoo, it's awesome. Like, no fooling. It's great. No problems. Totally happy. Would do it again. I give it 11 out of 10. 2 thumbs up. Um, but the it's more about the cultural views
Mm-hmm.
and the expectations of women as they slide into, 60s, 70s, and beyond.
Mm-hmm.
um and, like, not wanting to go quietly into that good night, and demanding to be seen, and demanding to be heard. So really, that was, as much as my animated, like, my what was in my mind was, I'm angry at men,
Mm-hmm.
I'm angry at relationships ending, I'm angry at all of this stuff, I'm angry at my career. It When I look at it now, I say, no, it's really about menopause.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
And it's also about
And,
women being remembered. Like I was
mhm.
rereading some of the bits that I had underlined in the book, and kind of at the very end it's about Dorothy not letting anyone forget what she did, who she was.
Right. Yeah, well, I think, I mean, I think that the twin narratives of Dorothy and Emma,
Mhm.
Emma's her best
Mhm.
friend, and sort of the moral center of the book, um, they're really stories of women creating their own lives, and making choices that serve their own artistic creations. And that's ultimately what it's about. What's been most surprising in the reception of the book, especially honestly since Anya Taylor Joy put it on her Snapchat story
Yes.
last like October, is which was like seriously God's old and new, bless her. It was just before the paperback came out in the US, and it could not have been timed better.
Mhm.
Is how widely um, it's been accepted and loved by 20-year-old women. I did not see that coming,
Mm.
not at all. Did not imagine it in my wildest dreams, and it makes me so unbelievably happy to see that it's something that's resonating, with the youngs. Um, and yeah, that's the most surprising and coolest thing from my end of the
And
couch.
you mentioned it a little bit before, but I wanted to ask you now about that journey from when you finished the novel in that 6-month period that you gave
Hmm.
yourself to
Hmm.
actually getting it published. And kind of could you talk a little bit about how people were receiving it on the, before it actually got put out?
Yeah, so it took me a couple of years to find an agent. I'd had an agent.
Hmm.
I had an agent who was repping my nonfiction stuff, and I showed her my novel, and her first reaction was to flatten out the voice. And she did a line edit of like the first 3 chapters, where she basically made it as monotone as possible. And I got it, and I was just like so crushed. I was so crushed. And so I turned to a friend of mine who, was short on cash. And I was like, look, here's a couple $100. Go through, make these edits because I can't do it. I feel like I'm killing I feel like I'm killing my child. Like I cannot do this. But I do want to see what it looks like because maybe the agent is right. And so she did. And I get the manuscript back, and I'm like, okay, I hate it. It's like, thanks, I hate it. And I was so disheartened that it sat for a year.
Hmm.
Before I actually ended up finding somebody who was my original agent, Jen Udden, and I found her on Twitter. And it took Jen about 2 years to sell it to Audible. Um, During that time, I think we had 18, 20 rejections. Some of them were along the lines of, and I'm not kidding, I quote here, she's too good at writing gore.
What?
It's like, are you familiar with the work of, I don't know, Chuck Palahniuk? Like, are you familiar with American Psycho, which has had a movie, a play, and a musical written about it and has never been out of print since the early 80s when it came out? Like, are you effing kidding me? Yeah, I got a lot of rejections that were just like, I can't. It makes me feel all oogie inside, is what it came down to. So we finally sold it to Audible, and it was an Audible original for a year. And I thought, okay, great. At this point, who is like somebody's going to buy it because it's already been published in one format.
Hmm.
So yay. Now another 10, 15 rejections. I think, I think we got somewhere around in the neighborhood of like 30 rejections
Hmm.
in total before Unnamed bought it and put it out as a hardback. Whereupon it got multiple rave reviews, and it's been Currently, I it's in coming out in five more languages with
Amazing.
two more in the waiting. It got optioned. I am not. I don't like right now.
Oh,
The
you don't
option
have to.
window is coming to yeah, it's coming to a close. So I don't know what's going
Hmm.
to happen with that. Um, but yeah, so I've been really, really pleased with
Hmm.
the reception of it, and I feel really vindicated considering how many rejections this book got.
Hmm.
And maybe it was that none of us understood that it was horror, and just weren't marketing it to the right editors. I have no clue. It's really hard for me to say. It was literally my first rodeo. It was my
Hmm.
debut novel. I've never had a book come out, so I don't have any experience to compare it to.
And do you think that reaction, and I'm talking kind of about both the long period of rejections from editors, but also about this embrace of the book by audiences. Do you think that kind of reaction, very visceral, either oh no or yes, absolutely, reaction is because Dorothy's is a killer, because she's a cannibal killer, because she's very sexually independent and empowered, or because she's also kind of a snob, but also has
Oh, I
all the
think
ammunition to
yes.
be a snob?
Oh, yes, all of it. Absolutely. I really think that it was I think that the main reason is that she's a woman and she's a cannibalistic serial killer.
Mm.
Like I think that was the thing that people had the hardest time wrapping their heads around in terms of, publishing. And let's face it, publishing is driven by capitalism,
Yeah.
and it is a deeply, deeply conservative industry with no imagination. So until they see a thing selling, they
Mm-hmm.
can't imagine that the new thing would sell. Um, so I'm not surprised. And also, the book is a satire of the publishing industry. It really
Mm-hmm.
spares no punches about how terrible publishing is. So I think that those things together, I can understand why people had the reaction that they did, even though I think that the reaction that they did was really dumb and short sighted. Um, but I also think that the reason why it's getting the reception that it has been getting is that it is, it's about a woman who's a cannibalistic serial killer, and gives zero fucks, and will not apologize to anybody ever about literally anything. Um, yeah, yeah. The weirdest reactions to me are the ones where people are like, 3 stars, it was fine. I'm like, really? It was fine? Are you kidding me? It was just fine. Like, either love it or hate it. Like, what is your problem? Yeah.
I mean, maybe those are the true psychopaths who just don't react to to the gore. I did want to ask you about the central relationships that Dorothy has. And one of them I really, obviously the main one is with Emma, but I was really surprised at the revelation of her kind of falling in love at one point in
Hmm.
on her life with Alex, and kind of then
Yeah.
walking away from that love. Because in the entire kind of previous build-up of her character and the building of her character, she was unapologetically unfeeling about
Hmm.
everyone else. So can you talk a little bit about how those two relationships play into her character in the book?
Yeah. So, from the very beginning that Dorothy is writing from prison,
Mm-hmm.
and you see the crime that put her in prison. And I made that choice because there is no reason for a serial killer to write a memoir unless they know that they are already caught. Because otherwise, you're just writing a giant confession,
Mm-hmm.
right? So the question for me became how to make it not a does she get caught, but to make it, why did she do it? Like, what is the big why? And I thought that one of the things that would make her want to make the choices that she did, which is to kill her ex lovers and then eat them, was a feeling that I'd always had about relationships, which is that you're in this relationship, you love this person, they're seeing sides of you that nobody else gets to see. You're profoundly and deeply intimate. You open yourself up in ways that are uncomfortable and vulnerable and and a little and terrifying. And then the relationship is over, and you still have all of these feelings, but that person is gone. They're
Mm.
just gone from your life. And so what do you do with them? And for solving the problem of Dorothy was like the question of like, all right, she wants to keep these men in her life, in part because she's a major control freak, but also because she doesn't want to age alone by herself. Um, and the way to make that work for me was to have a love affair. And I'll be honest, I hate rom coms. I can name two or three rom coms that I like. I like It Happened One Night. I like uh, Forgetting Sarah Marshall. And I like, there's one more that it's the one with Jessica Williams. It's kind of an anti rom com.
Oh,
It's an indie.
the really recent one from a few years ago.
Yeah,
Yes, I know exactly which one you're talking about, and the name now escapes me. What is the name of that film? Oh, The Incredible Jessica James?
that's it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And those are the three rom coms I like. Um, And so her relationship with Alex has all of the rom-com tropes. There's, a forgotten relationship, there is a meet cute, there is, the slow building of affection, there is a marriage proposal on top of the Empire State Building. There are all of these things that feel like, okay, this is the end of Dorothy
Mm-hmm.
as a cannibalistic serial killer, but really it's the beginning of her
Mm-hmm.
as a cannibalistic serial killer, because it is her leaving of Alex and rejecting the person she would be had she married him, that spurs her into, um, you know, having it not just be that one time in Italy that, what
Mm-hmm.
stays, the liver you eat that in Italy stays in Italy. Like she brings the cannibalism into her current life.
Mm-hmm.
Um, as for Emma, I didn't go in writing the book expecting there to be a female best friend. But after I so okay, just to back up a
Mm-hmm.
little bit, in my mind, there are two basic kinds of fiction writers. There are architects and there are explorers. Architects have a plan. They have a drawing, they know what the house is going to look like, they know who's going to be in it, they know where the furniture is going to be, they know how they're going to, like where the staircases are, they know like what is going to happen throughout the course of the book.
Mm-hmm.
Explorers have no freaking idea. There's just there's an America shaped continent, you're leaving Sweden, you're in a long boat, and you're hoping maybe you kind of get there and find some, I don't know, food. um, and I'm an explorer, especially in this book. So I had written the scene where Dorothy goes to college in Penniston, which is a thoroughly made up liberal arts school in Vermont, and she has a roommate, and they hate each other, and eventually she rediscovers her in Boston like a few years after graduation, um, and they become unlikely best friends. And I didn't know that that was going to be part of the book. I didn't know what Emma's role was going to be in Dorothy's life.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't really have a vision for how it was going to be meaningful. I just knew from the very first scene that it was going to be a bigger relationship than what I'd anticipated.
Mm-hmm.
And because so much about the book is about discovering and rejecting femininity, and female, and about finding your way as a female identifying person
Mm-hmm.
and about female friendships, um, even pre Emma, like it became important to me to have a female relationship, with friends where you would see a side of Dorothy that you wouldn't see otherwise.
And to wrap up our conversation, Chelsea, I just wanted to ask you a slightly bigger question that relates to a lot of the things that are in the book and also that we've been talking about. Kind of, where do you think, or why do you think this idea of hunger or of appetite comes into this? I hesitate calling it a new wave, but it has been something that I've been seeing a lot in the last few years in, feminist body horror or feminist horror, however you want to call it. And it's in the DNA of Dorothy as a character, from her work
Mm-hmm.
as a food critic, from even her identity as a cannibal, from her murderous instincts as well, for her appetite for fine things, for men, for travel, for living, but also in very literally, it's also in the title of the book. So can you talk a little bit about kind of how do you think this idea of hunger fits into the feminist horror of it all?
Yeah, so this was another thing that I didn't consciously think about at all as I was writing the book. I wasn't like, oh, yeah, so this is actually about my messed up lifelong relationship with food and denying, my own feelings of hunger and denying myself the things that I actually wanted to eat and denying myself like the eating as much as I wanted to, or feeling guilty about eating the things that I did. Um, so fiction, it comes from your brain. Like no matter what, you're going to be writing stuff that is like, hello, Dr. Freud, white courtesy telephone, please, and women have to, at least, culturally, women are expected to perform self control, and it's most visible in our self control of appetite. Like eating and disciplining your body in a way that doesn't take up too much space, that conforms to a patriarchal, specifically white concept of beauty, that shows that you have the ability to manage a family, manage a family's finances, manage a family's eating, manage a family's pantry. All of that stuff is wrapped up together. Um, and when women have unruly appetites, it is considered it, like women get disparaged for it. You're a slut, you're a slag, you're a fat whore, you are whatever bundle of epithets people want to throw at you because you haven't maintained this tightrope walk of what is acceptable. And those kinds of constraints just scream out for horror. They scream out to be exploded in the most visceral, bloody, arterial spray kind of ways. Because it's not fair, ultimately it's just not fucking fair that like a women, and here I'm using women as like identifying
Mm-hmm.
as woman, um, need or are expected to conform to this very limited, circumspect role in order to be culturally acceptable. And it's dumb and it's unfair, and men can eat as many frickin' cheeseburgers as they want and nobody says, boo to them. I mean, like, I remember when Dennis Franz's ass was out on NYPD Blue, and was like, everybody was like, oh my god, and like, and James Gandolfini, what a sex symbol. Like, really, are you kidding me? That's a sex symbol and I'm expected to look like, fill in the blank. So yeah, i think that um I think that rules and constraints create the possibility for, and even the necessity for, really sick, bloody horror.
I think that's a wonderful note to end on. Chelsea, thank you so much for your time and for this
Thank you.
conversation. And for anyone who's more curious about discovering more of your work, where can people find A Certain Hunger and more of your work online?
Yeah, I haven't really been writing a lot of nonfiction lately, for a variety of reasons, mostly because, I don't want to, but also I would want to, but it's hard to be paid enough where it's like really worth my time. But I am working on a new book. So A Certain Hunger is out in the US. It's coming out in the UK in this July. It'll be out in Estonia and Russia at some point later this year, and it'll be out in Italy and in France in 2023, and then hopefully as well the Netherlands and Germany. We're waiting on those deals. So yeah, and other than that, I'm on Twitter frequently.
Amazing. And hopefully we'll get to see a screen adaptation of A Certain Hunger sometime soon.
Yeah, that would be awesome.
Thank you so much.
All right, thank you.